Marshal Orson Pike slammed the envelope down on Elowen Mercer's counter hard enough to rattle the glass jar of penny candy beside the register. "You want to know what kind of man walked back into your life?" he said, loud enough that two women browsing fabric bolts near the window went still. "Because I'll tell you exactly what kind." Elowen didn't flinch. She set down the pencil she'd been using to tally accounts and looked at him with the kind of patience that had nothing warm in it. "Lower your voice, Orson." "I will not." He jabbed a finger at the envelope. "Read it. Read every word. Then tell me whether you still want that man sitting at your father's supper table." The two women near the window were no longer pretending to shop. Elowen did not reach for the envelope. That was the moment Orson Pike realized he had already lost something, he just didn't know how much yet. If this story already has your attention, the kind that makes you forget you were supposed to be doing something else, then you're exactly who this channel was made for. Subscribe right now and hit that bell so you never miss what comes next. We tell stories about real people, real choices, and the kind of love that costs something before it gives anything back. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Like this video, and let's begin. The morning Bram Callow rode into Red Willow, Elowen Mercer was in the middle of an argument about flour. Not a small argument. The kind that had been building for 6 days between her and the supply broker out of Tucson, a round-shouldered man named Delbert Haynes, who believed that a woman managing a general store was fundamentally a temporary situation, and that patience on his part would eventually be rewarded with a more reasonable man to negotiate with. He had been waiting 3 years for that man to appear. Elowen had been running Mercer's general store for 7. "Delbert," she said, spreading the invoice flat on the counter between them, "you've billed us for 48 sacks. We received 39. I have counted them myself. Twice. My father counted them once before his hip made the stairs difficult, and once after, just to be thorough. 39 sacks. So you can either correct the invoice or explain to me in plain language why I should pay for 9 sacks of flour that are not in my storeroom." Delbert pressed his lips together in the manner of a man selecting his next argument from a limited supply. "Shipping errors happen, Miss Mercer. It could be the count was off at the depot. Then I'd like the depot's signed receipt. I don't carry. I know you don't carry it. Which means the discrepancy is yours to resolve, not mine to absorb." She picked up her pencil and drew a firm line beneath the contested figure. "Corrected invoice by Friday. Pay what's fair, I always do. Charge me for air, and we'll find a different broker." Delbert Haynes gathered his papers with the dignity of a man who had chosen, again, to lose gracefully. He was nearly at the door when it opened from the outside, and he had to step back to make room. The man who came in was tall not in a dramatic notice-me way, but in the way of someone who had spent years outdoors doing physical work, and had simply become the shape of it. He wore a road-dusted coat, carried his hat in his hand rather than keeping it on, and looked around the store with the careful attention of someone relearning a place he had known differently. Delbert edged past him without acknowledgement. The man stepped up to the counter. Elowen's was still writing, finishing her notation on the invoice before she looked up. When she did, she expected a stranger. She did not expect gray eyes. Not that particular gray the color of creek water in November, steady and deep and a little cold until you looked long enough to find the warmth underneath. She had seen those eyes exactly once before in her life, and that had been 20 years ago, and the boy they had belonged to had been 10 years old, and standing under a cottonwood tree, making a promise she had eventually decided to stop believing in. Her pencil stopped moving. The man watched her recognize him. He didn't rush it. He didn't smile yet. He just let it happen, the way you let a spooked animal settle before you take another step. "Elowen," he said. Her name in his mouth was the same. That was the thing that hit her first and hardest, not his face, which had changed, not his height, or the breadth of his shoulders, or the lines that the last 2 decades had cut around his eyes. It was that her name sounded exactly the way it had when she was 10 years old, and he had said it like it meant something worth keeping. She set the pencil down. "Bram Callow," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was grateful for that. "You're dusty." He looked down at his coat, at the reddish trail grime that had settled into the weave. "I rode from Santa Fe. Takes a few days. I know how far Santa Fe is." "I figured you would." A silence opened between them. Not uncomfortable, exactly. More like the silence of two people who have a great deal to say and are each trying to determine what order it goes in. "You look," he started. "Don't," she said, not harshly. Just the single word, with enough weight to stop him. She had been receiving comments about her appearance since she was 14 years old, and she had made a private policy of cutting them off before they could be used as currency. "What brings you back to Red Willow, Bram?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Simply, I told you I would." Elowen felt something move in her chest, some small, inconvenient thing she thought she'd packed away years ago. She pressed it flat and kept her expression even. "You were 10, she said. "I was 10. Children say things, I know they do." He turned his hat in his hands, once the way a man does when he's working out how honest to be. "I also know I wasn't saying a thing. I was making a plan." Elowen looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her pencil again, not because she had anything to write, but because she needed something to do with her hands. "My father is in the back," she said. "He'll want to see you. He always liked you, even after you left." Bram's expression shifted, something grateful in it, something a little raw. "And you?" "I don't know yet," Elowen said honestly. "Give me more than one afternoon." Silas Mercer was 64 and moved like a man negotiating with his own body carefully, deliberately, with occasional moments of stubbornness that cost him more than he admitted. His hair had gone fully white in the years since Bram had last seen him, and his hands shook slightly when he poured coffee, but his eyes were the same, quick, interested, missing nothing. He took one look at Bram, standing in the doorway of the back room, and said, "Well, you got big." "Yes, sir," Bram said. "You finally come back to say you're sorry for taking my best knife before you left?" Bram blinked. Then something loosened in his face, a genuine laugh that Elowen heard from the front of the store and stopped to listen to without quite meaning to. "I forgot about that knife," Bram said. "I didn't." Silas waved him toward the chair across from his own. "Sit down before I decide to be angrier about it. Tell me where you've been. 20 years is a lot of where." Bram sat, and he told him. Not the version with the gaps smoothed over, the way you tell a story to impress someone. He told Silas the actual version, the 2 years in Texas working cattle for wages that barely covered his boots, the failed venture in Kansas that left him broke at 22 and too stubborn to quit, the 3 years learning range management from an old rancher in Colorado who had no patience for stupidity and consequently taught him more than any other man he'd known. And then New Mexico. The land he'd bought piece by piece over 8 years, more luck than planning in the beginning, more planning than luck by the end. The cattle operation that had grown slowly, painfully, into something that produced a real living. Not wealth exactly, but enough, more than enough. Silas listened to all of it with the focused attention of a man who had been reading people across a counter his whole life and had gotten very good at knowing which parts were true. "In Juniper Crown Ranch," Silas said when Bram finished. "That's yours outright?" "Mine outright. No partner, no bank lien. I paid the last of it 18 months ago." Bram paused. "That's when I started making arrangements to come back here." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know she's had offers." "I assumed." "Good ones." "A judge from Flagstaff. A rancher out of Prescott with more money than sense and twice as much land. A dentist once, which I thought was creative." Silas's mouth twitched. "She turned every one of them away without what I'd call a difficult decision." "I'm not here to be another offer," Bram said carefully. Silas looked at him steadily. "Then what are you here to be?" Bram thought about that. "Someone she can decide about," he said finally. "That's all. Someone she can actually look at and decide about, instead of a memory she's been carrying around." Silas was quiet for longer this time. Something moved through his expression, not approval exactly, but recognition. The look of a man who has heard a great many wrong answers and knows one that isn't. "She hasn't been waiting for you," Silas said. "I want that to be clear." "I know that. She built a full life. She runs this store better than I did at my best. She sits on the town council. She teaches the Halverson children and the Dupree children, and that O'Brien boy, who is frankly a handful, every Tuesday and Thursday evening, because nobody else would." Silas leaned forward slightly. "She is not a girl in a story waiting for a hero to ride in. You understand me?" "I understand you," Bram said. "Good." Silas leaned back. "Then you can stay for supper." Supper at the Mercer house was cornbread and salt pork, and a conversation that moved between comfortable and charged in a way that kept Bram slightly off balance, which he suspected was not entirely accidental. Elowen asked him questions that were polite on the surface and pointed underneath. How he managed water rights on Juniper Crown during dry seasons. Whether he'd had any trouble with land claims from the railroad expansion moving through New Mexico. what he thought about the territorial legislature's recent decisions on range fencing. Bram answered all of them as honestly as he could, including the ones where the honest answer was that he'd made mistakes. I fenced the east pasture 3 years ago, he said, and lost access to a creek that 2 neighboring families had been using for a generation. Didn't realize it until the second dry month. Had to pull 2 miles of fence and start over. He paused. Cost me the fence, cost me the time, and cost me something harder to put a number on. Elowen set her fork down. What did you do about the families? Went to each of them. Explained what happened. Offered grazing access on my east land through the season as partial compensation. He met her eyes. It wasn't enough. But it was what I had. She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked her fork back up. Silas watched the exchange with the careful attention of a man who had learned that the most important conversations were often the ones that looked like something else. After supper, while Silas settled into his chair by the window, Elowen walked out onto the narrow porch. Bram followed because she didn't tell him not to. The evening had cooled, and the main street of Red Willow was settling into its night version, fewer horses, softer voices, lantern light beginning to show in windows. You're more careful than I expected, Elowen said. She was looking at the street, not at him. How do you mean? The way you answer questions. You don't try to make yourself sound better than the situation was. She paused. Most men who've been away that long come back with a polished version. I had a polished version. I tried it in Kansas, trying to impress a banker. He leaned against the porch post. It didn't work, and I lost the money anyway. Decided polished was more effort than it was worth. Elowen almost smiled. Almost. What do you want from being back here, Bram? Plainly. He looked at her then, not at what she looked like, though she was exactly as beautiful as the girl he'd carried in his memory, and more complicated, in ways that interested him considerably more. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the problem of the creek and the fence, as a thing that deserved his full attention and his full honesty. I want to find out whether what I remembered was real, he said. And I want to find out who you are now, not who you were at 10. He paused. And if at the end of that, you tell me to go back to New Mexico, I'll go. No argument. Elowen was quiet for a moment. The street sounds drifted up. Somewhere down the block, a horse shifted and blew out a long breath. Stay a while then, she said finally. Not for me. Stay because Red Willow is a decent town worth seeing properly. She glanced at him. But you work for it. You don't sit around waiting to be noticed. I wasn't planning to. I know. She straightened, and the almost smile came all the way to the surface for just a moment. You brought the same hat you always wore. You just got bigger underneath it. She went back inside before he could answer. Bram stood on the porch and let the evening settle around him, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that wasn't quite hope but was close enough to feel like it. He found a room at the boarding house run by a stout, efficient widow named Mrs. Callahan, who charged fair rates and had a rule against tobacco indoors that she enforced without apology. Bram paid 2 weeks in advance and carried his own bag up the stairs. The next morning he was at Mercer's general store at 7 o'clock with a hammer and a bucket of nails. Elowen, unlocking the front door, looked at him, then at the hammer, then at him again. The loading dock, he said. Third plank from the left is soft. Somebody's going to step through it and break an ankle. She looked at him for a long moment. The nails are in the back room, second shelf. I brought my own. He spent the morning on the loading dock. He didn't ask for supervision, didn't need it, and didn't interrupt the store's operation. He replaced the soft planks, reinforced the railing along the right side that had developed a troubling lean, and discovered that 2 of the support beams underneath were water damaged, and quietly mentioned it to Elowen during the midday lull. Can it wait? She asked, looking up from her accounts ledger. 2 months, maybe 3. After that, it's a problem. She noted it in her ledger. I'll get you lumber costs by the end of the week. I'll get the lumber costs, Bram said. Tanner's mill on the South Road? Tanner retired. His nephew runs it now. The nephew is reasonable but slow to deliver, so order more than you think you need. Good to know. He started to turn. Bram. She said his name with just enough weight to turn him back. This isn't payment. Whatever you're doing here, it isn't a transaction. He held her gaze. I know that. I don't need someone to fix my dock to earn my attention. I know that too. He didn't look away. I just needed something useful to do with my hands in the morning. The dock was convenient. Elowen looked at him for a moment longer. Then she went back to her ledger. But something in her posture had changed by about a degree, The way a door changes when someone has eased the tension on the hinge. By the end of the first week, Bram Callow had become a presence in Red Willow rather than a curiosity in it. He'd helped the Halverson brothers move equipment to their north pasture, spent an afternoon at the farrier's when old Pete Dundas threw his back out and couldn't finish a job he'd promised, and attended one of Elowen's evening reading sessions not as a student, but sitting quietly near the back while she worked with the O'Brien boy on vowel sounds with the patience of a woman who had made peace with a very long game. He watched the way she taught, specific, direct, never condescending. When the boy got something wrong, she didn't soften it into meaninglessness. She named it, fixed it, moved on. No drama, no praise that wasn't earned. After the children left, she stacked her books with the efficient movements of a woman who did everything as well as it could be done and expected nothing less from herself. "You're staring," she said without turning. "Thinking," he said. "About? You're harder on yourself than you are on anyone else in that room." She paused with a book in her hand. "I'm not—" The O'Brien boy read 3 lines wrong, and you told him what he got right before you corrected him. You made 2 errors in your demonstration and didn't acknowledge either one. He said it without judgment, just an observation. She set the book down and looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. "That's a very specific thing to notice. You told me to pay attention. I told you to make yourself useful. I can do both." She almost smiled again. He was beginning to catalog those almost smiles, the way you catalog useful landmarks in unfamiliar territory. They told him where he was. "Go home, Bram," she said. But there was something warmer in it than the words. The warrant for how things would actually complicate came on a Friday morning, 10 days after Bram's arrival, in the form of Marshal Orson Pike. Elowen was aware of Orson's interest in her the way you're aware of weather. It was a condition of being in Red Willow, not a relationship she had chosen or encouraged. Orson was a competent marshal, well regarded, a man who maintained order with enough even-handedness that most of the town respected him. He was also a man who had decided, somewhere in the last few years, that Elowen Mercer belonged in his future, and who had never quite said so directly because her habit of making her own decisions made direct statements risky. He came into the store on that Friday, with his badge freshly polished, and his expression arranged in the careful neutral of a man delivering information he considers a gift. "Morning, Elowen." "Orson." She was sorting a new delivery, working through a checklist. "What do you need?" "I need a few minutes of your time." His eyes moved to where Bram was unloading a crate near the back. Privately, "I'm busy until noon. It's about Callow." Elowen looked up. "Then say it here or don't say it." Something flickered in Orson's expression, irritation, briefly visible and quickly smoothed. He had a land transaction in Santa Fe 18 months ago. Widow named Lucinda Hale. He bought her ranch. People buy ranches. At a price that should make you ask questions. Orson put a folded piece of paper on the counter. 40% below assessed value. Woman had 3 children and a mortgage she couldn't pay. He showed up right when she was most desperate. Elowen looked at the paper but didn't touch it yet. "Where did you get this?" "I made inquiries. Because I look out for this town and the people in it." "You made inquiries into a private citizen who arrived 10 days ago. A private citizen who walked straight to the most prominent woman in Red Willow and has been sleeping at her door ever since." Orson's voice stayed even, but something underneath it wasn't. "I'm doing my job, Elowen." She picked up the paper. She read it. She set it back down. "I'll look into it," she said. "You don't have to. I can tell you." I said I'll look into it. She met his eyes with the kind of directness that made most men recalibrate. "Thank you for bringing it, Orson." "I mean that. Now let me work." She did not go to Bram. She wrote 2 letters that afternoon, one to the Santa Fe Land Registry office, one to a woman she knew who kept records at the territorial courthouse in Prescott. She asked for specifics: transaction price, assessed value at time of sale, any documentation of the circumstances. She told no one about it. Not Silas. Not Bram. When Bram asked that evening, during the walk she had allowed to become a small routine, why she seemed quieter than usual, she said, "I'm thinking about a business matter," which was not a lie. He didn't push. She noticed that about him, the way he let things be when pushing would have been easier. Whether that was wisdom or strategy, she hadn't determined yet. They walked as far as the old cottonwood at the edge of the Mercer property. It was older and thicker than it had been, naturally, and the bark was dark with age, but it was the same tree. You could tell by the shape of the crown and the way the roots had buckled the earth in the same pattern she'd been watching since childhood. Bram stopped, looked at it. He reached out and touched the bark and said nothing. Elowen watched him. Watched the thing move across his face, not sentiment exactly, not nostalgia. Something more complicated. Something that looked like a man taking an accounting of the years and finding the total both better and harder than expected. I thought about this tree more times than was probably reasonable, he said. What did you think about it? That it would be here. He dropped his hand. That it wouldn't change. That something would still be the same when I came back. Things don't stay the same, no. He looked at her. They don't. They get better or they get worse or they just get more of what they already were. He paused. You're more of what you always were. Elowen looked at the tree for a moment. Is that a compliment? Depends on what you think you were. She laughed. Not a polite laugh, a genuine one, the kind that surprised her slightly when it came out. She didn't laugh that freely very often, and she was aware of it. Bram watched her laugh with an expression she caught only for a moment before he looked away, but it was long enough. It was the expression of a man who has been waiting for something specific and has just, unexpectedly, received it. She stopped laughing, looked at him. Don't read too much into that, she said. I'm not reading anything, he said mildly. I'm just standing here. You're not just standing anywhere, Elowen said, and they both knew what she meant. The letters came back 11 days later. Elowen read them twice at the kitchen table before Silas was awake, with her coffee going cold beside her. The Santa Fe Land Registry confirmed the sale yes, 40% below assessed value at the time of transaction. The letter from Prescott was more detailed. A woman named Lucinda Hale had sold her ranch, the Double H, in March of the previous year. She had 3 children. Her husband had died 14 months prior, leaving a mortgage held by a Tucson bank that had been accelerating its repayment terms in a manner the Territorial Oversight Board had subsequently flagged as potentially improper. And then the last paragraph. Lucinda Hale had written a letter to the Territorial Records Office 8 months after the sale, requesting it be attached to the transaction documentation. Elowen's contact had copied it out by hand and included it. The sale of the Double H to Mr. Bram Callow of Juniper Crown Ranch, New Mexico Territory, was conducted at a price agreed upon between both parties with full knowledge of the property's condition. Mr. Callow inspected the property and identified 3 structural deficiencies and a water rights dispute with the adjacent Kellerman parcel that reduced the usable value significantly. The agreed price reflected these reductions, not any hardship on my part as a negotiating disadvantage. Mr. Callow paid promptly, and upon completion of the sale, personally arranged for transport assistance for my family at no additional cost. I am writing this record because I have heard that the transaction has been characterized unfavorably in certain quarters, and I wish to correct that characterization. L. Hale, November 1886. Elowen sat with that letter for a long time. She thought about Orson Pike, standing at her counter with his polished badge and his folded paper and his careful expression. She thought about what he had said, I'm doing my job. She thought about what he had not said, the water rights dispute, the structural deficiencies, the bank's improper acceleration terms that made the widow desperate not because of Bram, but before he ever arrived. She thought about a man who had gone to look at a widow's property, found problems other buyers had chosen to ignore or exploit, and offered a price that was honest about those problems, and then arranged the transport at no additional cost. She folded the letters carefully and put them in the tin box she kept locked in the store's back room, where she kept all documents that mattered. Then she went out to find Bram. He was at the mill, as she'd half expected, waiting on a lumber delivery that the nephew had promised and not yet produced. He was sitting on a fence post in the way of a man who has learned that impatience is expensive and patience is free, and he looked up when she came across the yard. The widow Hale, Elowen said, in Santa Fe. Something went through Bram's face, not guilt, not evasion. Something more like the careful attention of a person who has been waiting to find out which way a thing is going to fall. What about her? Orson told me the sale price was 40% below assessed value and implied you took advantage of her desperation. Bram was quiet. He didn't mention the water rights dispute with the Kellerman parcel, Elowen said, or the structural deficiencies, or the bank's acceleration terms that had nothing to do with you. She paused. He also didn't mention the letter she wrote to the Territorial Records Office. Bram looked at her steadily. You wrote for the records. I write for the facts when someone puts a story in front of me. She held his gaze. Why didn't you just tell me? That first day, or any day since. He was quiet for a moment. Because if I'd told you the Santa Fe sale was actually fair, and here's the documentation to prove it, it would have sounded like I was asking you to trust me before you'd earned a reason to. He looked at the mill, then back at her. I wanted you to find out the same way you'd find out about anything else. Your way. Elowen stood in the mill yard and looked at this man she had spent 20 years trying to stop thinking about, and she felt something shift with a weight and a finality that was less like a door opening and more like a foundation, settling the kind of movement you only notice when the shaking stops. Orson isn't protecting me, she said, not a question. No, Bram said. I don't think he is. He's protecting something else. I expect so. She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was flat and practical on the mill yard's dust, and it was not a romantic setting by any honest measure. She had flour on her sleeve from the morning's inventory, and he had a splinter in his left hand. He'd been working it intermittently since she arrived. I'm not in love with you, she said, clearly and without cruelty. I know that, but I'm not opposed to finding out what I am. Bram nodded once, slowly, the way of a man accepting terms that are fair and more than he had any right to expect. That's enough, he said. And it was. For now, it was exactly enough. The lumber arrived 2 days late, which surprised no one who had dealt with the mill nephew, and Bram spent a Wednesday morning cutting and fitting the replacement beams under the loading dock while Elowen managed a delivery dispute with a hardware supplier that required considerably more patience than the lumber situation. Silas sat in his chair by the back window and watched both of them work with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has lived long enough to recognize when something is organizing itself correctly, even if it hasn't finished organizing yet. By noon, the beams were in, the dock was solid, and Bram had a blister on his right palm and sawdust in his hair. He came inside to wash his hands at the back basin and found Elowen at the account ledger with the expression she wore when the numbers were not cooperating. Hardware supplier short you? He asked. Hardware supplier tried to substitute a cheaper grade of hinge on 40 units and call it equivalent. She did not look up. It is not equivalent. What did you tell him? I told him I'd send the hinges back at his shipping cost and purchase from Flagstaff going forward. She made a notation, sharp and final. He's reconsidering. Bram dried his hands. You ever get tired of fighting for the right number on every invoice? She looked up then. Do you ever get tired of checking your fence line? Fair point. She went back to the ledger. The beams are good. I looked before you came in. You cut them right. It was not a lavish compliment. It was an accurate one, which was worth considerably more. That afternoon, Bram rode out to the Halverson property to return a draw knife he'd borrowed for the dock work, and he stayed long enough to help the older Halverson brother, Carl, work through a problem with a wheel axle that had been stubborn since the previous week. Carl was 50 and methodical, and once he decided a man knew what he was doing, he talked freely. He talked about Red Willow, the way people talk about a place they've watched change slowly enough that each change seemed small, and the total of them is startling. The town had grown not explosively, but steadily. New families, new businesses. The school had expanded. A physician had come and stayed, which was not always a given in frontier towns. And then Carl said, leaning back from the axle with grease on his forearms, Pike's been around to see you yet? He came to the store, Bram said. Spoke to Elowen. Carl grunted. About you, I'd guess, about me. Carl worked at a bolt. Orson's not a bad man. I want to be clear about that. He does his job, mostly does it straight. But he's had an idea about Elowen Mercer for 2 or 3 years, and the idea's got a hold of him in a way that's made him less than straight on that particular subject. He glanced at Bram. You should know that going in. I think I do, Bram said. Good. Carl got the bolt free, examined it, put it aside. She know you're back for real? Not just passing through? She knows. And she's thinking about it. Carl nodded slowly. That's about right. She doesn't do anything fast that doesn't need to be fast. It's why the store's still standing, and every other merchant who underestimated her isn't. He picked up the replacement bolt. You patient? 20 years worth, Bram said. Carl looked at him, then back at the axle. Then you might be all right. The town council meeting happened on a Thursday, and Bram did not attend it, but he heard about it the same evening from Elowen, who came home from it with the particular tight-shouldered quality of a woman who has spent 2 hours being talked over and has not yet decided what to do about it. She came out to the back porch where Bram was sitting with Silas, who had developed the habit of evening air on account of his hip being better in warm weather, and she stood at the railing looking at the yard. The Prescott Development Group sent a representative, she said. He had a very good suit and a very large map. Silas raised an eyebrow. The railroad people? Railroad adjacent. They want land along the northern approach. They're calling it a commercial development corridor, which is what people say when they mean railroad easement and don't want to negotiate on the details. She crossed her arms. They made a presentation. Numbers that sounded very good. The council was impressed. How impressed? Silas asked. Tom Bellamy was ready to vote tonight. I talked him out of it. Bram looked at her. What bothered you about it? She turned. The water access clause. It was in Section 4 of the proposed agreement, which most people didn't read, because Section 1 had the money numbers, and those were distracting enough. She came and sat down on the porch step, not in her usual composed way, but in the way of someone who is genuinely tired and not going to pretend otherwise. The clause gives the development company easement rights over the Northern Creek Draw, which sounds like nothing until you understand that the Northern Creek Draw feeds 3 wells and 2 irrigation channels that 7 families have been using for 40 years. Bram was quiet for a moment. They know that? The representative definitely knew it. He had a very smooth answer ready when I raised it. Something about shared infrastructure management and equitable access for all stakeholders. Her voice was dry, which is what people say when they mean they'll control it and let you use it as long as you don't cause them problems. What did the rest of the council say? Crawford said I was being cautious to the point of obstruction. Bellamy said we could negotiate the details after the agreement was signed. She looked out at the yard, which is the same as saying we'll worry about the terms once we no longer have leverage. Silas shook his head slowly. I said the vote waits until we have a revised clause in writing, Elowen said. They agreed. Reluctantly. She paused. The representative will be back in 2 weeks with a revised proposal. You think the revision will be real? Bram asked. No. I think it'll be cosmetic. New language around the same structure. She looked at him. But 2 weeks gives me time to understand exactly what they want and what we actually need to give up, as opposed to what they're hoping we won't notice. Bram looked at her for a long moment. She was tired and slightly frustrated and completely clear-headed about what she was dealing with, and there was something in watching her work through a problem in real time, not performing competence, but actually exercising it, that settled something in his chest that had been restless since he arrived. Do you know who owns the land on the northern approach? He said carefully. She looked at him. The territory controls most of it. There are 2 private parcels. The Ketterman family owns one. The other. She stopped. She looked at him with a new quality of attention. The other has been listed as estate held for 12 years. Nobody's made a claim. Bram said nothing. Elowen's eyes went still in the way they went still when she was putting pieces together. Bram. My grandfather homesteaded that land in 1861, he said. He died without a will. My father never pursued the claim. When my father died, it passed to me by default. He paused. I've been paying the territorial land tax on it for 9 years. It's called South Meadow on the survey maps. Elowen stared at him. Silas made a low sound that was not quite a word. South Meadow, Elowen said slowly, is the only direct approach to the northern corridor that doesn't require the railroad to add 4 miles of grade to go around the ridge. She paused. The development company needs that land. Yes, Bram said. They would pay a great deal for it. I expect they would. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully categorize, something between sharp assessment and something more personal underneath it. What are you going to do with that? Bram looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked at her. I don't know yet, he said. But I thought you should know it exists. It was the right answer. He could tell by the way she breathed out, slow and even, like a woman deciding to set down something she'd been carrying at a defensive angle. Don't do anything with it until we understand the full picture, she said. I wasn't planning to. Silas looked between the 2 of them, with the expression of a man watching a very complicated game of chess played by 2 people who were only partially aware they were playing it. I'm going to bed, he announced, and stood up carefully, and went inside, and left them there. The 2 weeks before the council's next meeting were not quiet. Orson Pike made 3 more visits to the general store, each one more pointed than the last. The first was to deliver what he called a courtesy update about a stranger who'd been asking questions in town about property records, a man from Prescott, Orson said, who had been hired by someone to compile land ownership information in the Red Willow area. He looked at Bram when he said it with the careful look of a man laying a card face up. Bram said, "Thank you, Orson," and went back to inventorying a new supply of rope. The second visit was more direct. Orson came in when Elowen was alone, late morning, and stood at the counter with his arms crossed and said, "I need you to hear me clearly on something." "I'm listening," Elowen said. "Callow's land in New Mexico, the Juniper Crown operation. I talked to a man who worked there 2 seasons ago. He says the ranch hands don't stay. Nobody lasts more than a year. That's not a stable operation, Elowen. That's a man who doesn't know how to hold something together once the newness wears off." Elowen set down the supply list she'd been reviewing. "What's this man's name?" A brief hesitation. "I'd rather not say. He spoke to me privately. Then I'd rather not take his word for much." She met Orson's eyes. "I appreciate that you're concerned. I've told you that before. But carrying me unnamed testimony about a man's character isn't protection, Orson. It's something else." His jaw tightened. I know what you're trying to do." She said it without anger, which was somehow harder for him to hear than anger would have been. "I've known for a while, and I understand it, I do. But it's not helping you, and it's not helping me, and I need you to consider stopping." He left without answering, and the bell above the door had a sharper sound to it than usual. That evening, Elowen told Bram about the ranch hand's claim. Not because she believed it, but because she thought he deserved to know what was being said. Bram listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "I've had 12 men work full seasons at Juniper Crown in the last 8 years. 7 of them left for better-paying work when the big outfits started pushing into New Mexico. 3 left because the work was harder than they expected. 1 left because he had a sick mother and needed to be closer to family. 1, he paused. 1 I let go because he was settling, which I'll admit to without drama." Elowen looked at him. "And the 12th, he's still there, running the day operation. His name is Delford Harris, and he's been with me 6 years, which I'd argue is evidence against the instability story." "I'd argue the same." She paused. "What happened to the one who stole?" "I gave him a week's pay and told him to go somewhere. His family didn't know him and tried to do better." He met her eyes. "I've thought about whether that was the right call. I don't know." He was 19. Elowen looked at him for a moment. "That's a very specific kind of imperfect decision. Most of mine are." She nodded once and went back to what she'd been doing. But the set of her face had changed slightly in the way it changed when she'd arrived at a conclusion she was still examining from different angles. The third visit from Orson came on a Saturday and had nothing polite about it. Bram was outside the store, loading finished supply orders into the Halverson wagon, when Orson came across the street with the deliberate walk of a man who has made a decision and is committed to it. He stopped a few feet from Bram and didn't lower his voice enough for the distance to matter. "I know about South Meadow," Orson said. Bram straightened. "Set down the crate, all right. I know what it's worth to the development company. And I know that you sitting on it, while Elowen fights to protect those water rights for 7 families, is convenient for you. Makes you look like a principled man." Bram looked at him steadily. "Is there a question in there?" "The question is what you're actually going to do with that land when someone makes you a number that's large enough to matter." "Then that's something you'll find out when it happens," Bram said. "Same as everyone else." Orson stepped closer, not threateningly, exactly more the way of a man crossing a line he'd been standing behind for too long. "I've watched over this town and the people in it for 9 years. Elowen Mercer is the finest woman I know, and she spent 20 years waiting for a man she half invented in her own memory. And now you're here making it look like you rode in to be her answer." "She's not waiting for an answer," Bram said. His voice stayed level. "She's not waiting for anything. She'll tell you that herself. She's too loyal to old things. No, she's too honest to let go of things that were real." He held Orson's gaze. "There's a difference." "You know there is." Something moved across Orson's face, anger. Yes, but underneath it something more painful. The look of a man who knows privately that the argument he's making is not the argument he actually wants to be having. He took a step back. "If you hurt her," he said, quietly, now, without the official edge. "If you walk away from here and she's worse for it, then you'll have had the right instinct and I'll have been the wrong man," Bram said. "And I'll carry that." He paused. "But I'm not planning on being the wrong man, Orson." Orson looked at him for another moment. Then he turned and walked back across the street, and Bram watched him go, and felt not triumph, but something close to sorrow for a man who had organized too much of himself around a hope that was not going to be answered the way he needed. Elowen had seen the exchange from the window. She didn't say anything about it when Bram came back inside, but she handed him a cup of coffee without being asked, and that was its own kind of sentence. 5 days before the council meeting, Elowen received a visit from a woman named Margaret Finch, who ran the dry goods operation on the south end of town, and who had 2 brothers farming in the northern corridor. Margaret was a practical, unsentimental woman in her mid-40s who did not make social calls without purpose. She sat across from Elowen in the back room and put her hands flat on the table and said, "I need to know if you found anything about that water clause, because my brothers need to know what they're facing." "I've found enough," Elowen said. "The revised proposal they're going to bring won't protect your brothers. The language will look different, but the structure will be the same. The company wants control of that creek draw, and they're not planning to trade it." Margaret's expression went hard. "What do we do? We need leverage they haven't accounted for." Elowen paused. "There's a parcel on the northern approach, South Meadow. It's privately held, and without access to it, the company's route adds significant cost and distance. If the owner of South Meadow conditions any sale or easement on guaranteed water rights for existing families, the company has to negotiate differently." Margaret looked at her carefully. "Who owns South Meadow?" Elowen met her eyes. "I know who owns it, but that's their decision to make, not mine to announce." "Does the owner know what it could mean?" "Yes," Elowen said. "They know." Margaret sat with that for a moment. "And you think they'll do right?" Elowen was quiet for half a breath. "I think they'll do what they believe is right," she said, "which is a different thing and also more reliable." Margaret nodded slowly. She stood, smoothed her skirt, and looked at Elowen with the frank look of a woman sizing up another one. "You've gotten more careful since the Bradford business," she said, which was a reference to a town council conflict from 2 years prior that Elowen had handled less cleanly than she would have liked. "I learned from it," Elowen said. "I know you did. That's why I came to you." She picked up her gloves. "Whatever happens at that meeting, we're with you." After she left, Elowen sat alone for a few minutes. Then she went to find Bram. He was at the mill. It was becoming a pattern this time, in genuine conversation with the nephew, who turned out to be more competent than his delivery record suggested, once someone spoke to him directly. She waited until the conversation was done, and they walked back toward town together in the late afternoon light. "I need to ask you something plainly," she said. "All right. South Meadow. The development company is going to make you an offer. Probably a good one. Before that meeting, before it becomes a public thing, I need to know what you're intending." Bram was quiet for a few steps. "You could have asked me that 2 weeks ago." "I know." She kept walking. "I wanted to understand the situation fully before I did. And I wanted to watch how you handled Orson." He glanced at her. "And? You didn't perform anything. When he pushed you, you didn't puff up or make speeches." She paused. "You just said what was true and let it be true. I've found that's generally the least expensive approach." She almost smiled, but there was something more serious underneath it. "The company's money would expand Juniper Crown significantly. That's not a small thing. It would change what you can build there, what you can leave behind eventually." She stopped walking. He stopped too. "I'm not asking you to sacrifice something enormous for Red Willow. These aren't your families. You haven't lived here for 20 years. Bram looked at her. "What are you asking?" "I'm asking what you actually want to do. Not what looks good. Not what helps your case with me." She held his eyes. "What do you actually want?" He was quiet long enough for it to mean something. "Those 7 families," he said, "built this valley before there was a town to build it around. The water they use, they've used since before the company's surveyors were born. If I sell South Meadow without conditions, the company gets what it wants, and those families spend the next 20 years managing access to something they built." He paused. "That bothers me. Not because it's a moral position I'm performing. It just bothers me." Elowen looked at him. Beyond which, he said, "Juniper Crown is big enough. I don't need to expand it. I need to run it well." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was behind him, and she had flour on her hands again from the morning, and the moment was completely ordinary, except for the thing happening inside her chest, which was not ordinary at all. It was the feeling of a very old question, finally getting an answer that was not what she'd expected and was better than what she'd hoped. She didn't say any of that. She said, "The meeting is Thursday. I'm going to need your written documentation of ownership before then. I'll have it to you by Tuesday. Thank you." She turned to keep walking. "Elowen." His voice behind her was quiet. She stopped but didn't turn all the way, just enough to show she was listening. "I know what this looks like," he said. "I know it looks like a man making a grand gesture to win a woman. I need you to know it's not that. Or it's not only that." He paused. "I was going to tell you about South Meadow the first week, before the railroad people were even a conversation. I told you because it seemed like information you should have, not because I was waiting for the right moment to use it." She thought about that. She thought about the timing. She thought about the day he'd mentioned it, quietly while they were talking about the council meeting, with no fanfare and no obvious calculation. She turned slightly more. "I know," she said. "That's why I asked." The Tuesday before the council meeting, Orson Pike came to the store one more time. He came in the quiet part of the afternoon when Silas was napping, and only Elowen was behind the counter. He stood for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "I owe you an apology." Elowen set down what she was doing and waited. "The Santa Fe business. I knew about the water rights dispute on the Hale property. I didn't mention it." He said it flat, without decoration. "And the ranch hand story I got, that from a man who'd been let go for taking things that didn't belong to him. I knew that when I brought it to you, and I brought it anyway." He met her eyes. "That was wrong." "I knew it was wrong." Elowen looked at him. "Why are you telling me this now?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I watched him talk to your father again last night. Silas was telling some story about the time you were 12 and flooded the storeroom, trying to mop the ceiling for some reason." "The mop slipped," Elowen said, despite herself. "And Callow was listening to it the way people listen when they're gathering something. Not being polite, actually wanting to know." Orson paused. "He's not performing, is he?" "No," Elowen said. "He's not." Orson looked at the counter. Then he looked at her. "I've been a fool about this." "You've been a man who wanted something," Elowen said carefully. "That's not the same as being a fool. But some of what you did," she paused. "Some of it wasn't honest, Orson. And you know me well enough to know what I do with that." "I know." He picked up his hat from the counter where he'd set it. "I'm sorry, Elowen." For all of it, he left. Elowen stood at the counter for a moment. Then she opened the tin box in the back room and took out the letter from Lucinda Hale and read it once more, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to remember exactly what honest looks like when someone writes it down. The council meeting was on a Thursday evening, and the Prescott Development Group's representative arrived with a revised proposal he'd promised, and a new associate who handled documents and said nothing but watched everything. Elowen read the revision in the meeting room while the representative explained its improvements. She read it twice. Then she set it flat on the table. "The water access structure is cosmetically different," she said. "The underlying control mechanism is identical." She turned to the third page. Section 3, subsection C. "The company holds primary easement determination rights over all tributary access points within the corridor. That means your board decides who uses the creek draw and under what conditions." The representative smiled the smile of a man who has been caught but is professionally obligated to keep trying. "Miss Mercer, the board's discretion is intended to ensure equitable management of shared resources." "We have a problem," said a voice from the back of the room. The room turned. Bram Callow was standing near the door, which he'd entered quietly enough that only Elowen had noticed. He held a folded document, in one hand the ownership papers, the ones he'd given her Tuesday, and she'd registered with the county recorder Wednesday morning. "South Meadow," he said. He didn't raise his voice. He walked to the front table and set the papers down beside Elowen's documents. "You need it for the direct northern approach. Without it, you're adding 4 miles of grade to go around the ridge, which changes your cost projections significantly." He looked at the representative. "I'm willing to discuss an easement, but the terms include permanent, uncontested water access rights for every current family on the northern corridor. Not managed, not discretionary. Permanent and documented at the county level before any ground is broken." The room was absolutely silent. The representative looked at the papers, then at Bram, then at Elowen, then back at Bram. "That would require the company to negotiate," Elowen said. "Yes." The representative's associate leaned over and said something too quiet to hear. Then the representative folded his hands and said, "We'll need to consult with our principals." "Of course," Elowen said. "We'll expect your answer within 10 days. After that, Mr. Callow's offers stands or it doesn't, and we proceed accordingly." Tom Bellamy, who had been ready to vote yes 3 weeks ago, was sitting with his arms crossed and something new working its way across his face. He looked at Bram, then at Elowen. Then he looked at Crawford beside him and said quietly, but not quietly enough, "She was right about the claws." Crawford said nothing. After the meeting, when the room had emptied, and Silas had gone home with the Halverson brother who'd offered a ride, Elowen and Bram were left in the council room with the papers spread across the table. She stacked them carefully, the way she did everything with attention, without hurry. "You walked in at exactly the right moment," she said. "I was there for 20 minutes, Bram said. "I was waiting for you to get to the claws. You could have come up earlier. It wasn't my meeting to lead." He looked at the papers. "It was yours. I was there in case the ownership documentation made a difference." Elowen looked at him. "It made a difference. So did you." He said it simply. "You'd already cornered them on the language before I opened my mouth. What I had was just the lock on the door." She considered that. Outside, the town had settled into its evening sounds as distant horses, a door closing somewhere, the dry, warm air moving through the window. "Orson came to apologize," she said. Bram looked at her. "What did you say?" "I accepted it. Told him some of what he'd done wasn't honest." She paused. "He knows that. I think he's known it for a while." "He's not a bad man," Bram said. "No. He's a man who let something he wanted make him smaller than he is." She looked at the window. "It happens." The room was quiet. She picked up the papers, tucked them under her arm, and moved toward the door. He followed, because it was natural to, because they had fallen into the habit of moving in the same direction, without either of them having decided to. Outside, the night was dark and warm and smelled of dust and something flowering from somewhere along the road. They walked without particular direction and without talking for a stretch, which was something she'd noticed about being with Bram. The silence was not a gap waiting to be filled. It was just another way of being in the same place. They ended up at the cottonwood, not by plan, simply by the way her feet had known the path since she was small. She stood looking at it, and he stood beside her, not close enough to crowd her, not far enough to make a performance of the distance. "I still don't know what I am," she said, "about you." "About this, I know," he said. "I'm not telling you that to manage your expectations. I know that too. I'm telling you because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort." She looked at him. "And because what I feel right now is inconvenient, and I haven't finished examining it." Bram looked at her in the dark with those gray eyes that had started this whole thing 20 years ago. "Take whatever time you need," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She believed him. That was the part that changed everything, not the grand gesture at the council meeting, not the sacrifice of the development money, not the 20 years he'd spent becoming the man who came back. It was the simple, unremarkable fact that she believed him. She had not believed anyone in a very long time. The cottonwood moved above them in the night wind, and somewhere their initials were still there in the bark, and she was 30 years old, and uncertain, and inconveniently in the process of falling toward something, and she did not say any of this. But she did not move away from the tree either. And Bram, who had learned patience the expensive way, stayed exactly where he was, and let the night and the silence, and the particular quality of Elowen Mercer, thinking through something important, do what they were going to do. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough. The Prescott Development Group's response came back in 8 days, not 10, which told Elowen something about how much they wanted the Northern Corridor, and how little they liked being made to wait for it. The response was not a concession. It was a counter dressed up in new language, delivered by a different representative, this one older and less smooth and consequently more dangerous. His name was Aldous Vance, and he arrived on a Tuesday morning with a leather briefcase and the particular brand of confidence that comes not from charm but from long experience in getting what he wants from people who thought they were prepared. He did not go to the town council first. He came to Mercer's general store. Elowen was alone when he walked in, which she suspected was not accidental. The bell above the door announced him, and she looked up from the supply manifest she'd been working through and took in the briefcase and the suit and the expression of a man who considers the opening of a negotiation to be a kind of surgery. Precise, impersonal, designed to cause the minimum necessary discomfort while achieving the maximum necessary result. "Miss Mercer," he said. He did not wait to be invited to the counter. He came to it and set the briefcase down, and opened it with the practiced motion of someone who does this many times a day. "I'm Aldous Vance, from the Prescott Development Group's regional office. I think we can move past the disagreement at your council meeting and find something that works for everyone." "I wasn't aware there was a disagreement," Elowen said. "I thought we were negotiating." He smiled briefly. Of course. I meant the impasse. He produced a document, not the same revised proposal from the council meeting, but something new, something thicker. We've reworked the water access terms substantially. I think you'll find this version genuinely addresses the concerns your community raised. Elowen took the document. She did not begin reading it. How did you know to come here rather than the council chambers? We did our research, he said. You're the one who identified the clause problem. You're the one whose council seat carries the most weight on land matters. And he paused, with the fractional hesitation of a man choosing whether to show a card. You're acquainted with the owner of South Meadow. I know a lot of people in Red Willow, Elowen said. Yes. He folded his hands on the counter. Mr. Callow's conditions were clear at the meeting. We'd like to speak with him directly. We believe there's a figure that could address everyone's interests. Mr. Callow sets his own schedule, Elowen said. I'm not his keeper. No, of course not. Vance's voice stayed easy, but something behind his eyes adjusted slightly a recalibration. He was deciding what kind of woman he was dealing with, and finding that the category he'd started with didn't quite fit. Nevertheless, if you have influence with him, I have no influence with Bram Callow in the way you mean it, Elowen said. He makes his own decisions. She picked up the document. I'll read this. If it has something in it worth bringing to the council, I will. That's what I can offer you. Vance held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once and closed his briefcase. I appreciate your time, Miss Mercer. We're at the Territorial Hotel through the end of the week. When he was gone, Elowen put the document under the counter and finished her manifest first. Then she locked the front door, went to the back room, and read every page. It took 40 minutes. When she was done, she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table and her eyes focused on nothing in particular, which was what she did when she was thinking through something that had multiple layers, and she needed to get the order of them right. The water access terms were better. Not good better. The language had shifted from discretionary management to what Vance's document called guaranteed reasonable access, which was an improvement in the same way that a smaller trap is an improvement over a larger one. You could still lose your hand. The deeper issue was a new clause she hadn't seen before. Section 6, subsection A, which established something called a Corridor Development Authority, a board composed of 3 company representatives and 2 community members, with final decision-making power over any land use changes within 500 yards of the railroad easement, which, when she traced it against the survey maps she had in her file drawer, encompassed the irrigation entry points for 4 of the 7 northern families. It was elegant, in the way that things are elegant when considerable intelligence has been applied to the project of taking something from people while making it look like giving. She unlocked the front door and went to find Bram. He was not at the mill or the store or the Halverson property. She found him, eventually, at the edge of South Meadow itself, standing at the property's northern boundary where a low rise of ground gave a clear view of the ridge and the approach corridor below it. He was looking at the landscape with the expression of a man taking a measurement that has nothing to do with distance. She climbed the rise and stood beside him. The view from up here was broad. You could see the shape of the whole northern approach, the way the land funneled naturally toward the ridge gap, the cottonwood-lined creek draw threading through the center of it. He came to the store, she said. I know. Carl Halverson saw him go in. Bram didn't look at her. He was still looking at the land. What did he bring? A revised proposal. Better on the water language, worse underneath it. There's a new development authority that would give them board control over land use near the easement. She paused. Including the irrigation entries. Bram was quiet. They're also going to come to you directly, she said. Probably today or tomorrow. They'll bring a number. I know they will. She looked at him. Bram, what they'd pay for an outright sale of South Meadow. What does that mean for Juniper Crown? He was quiet long enough that she knew he'd been thinking about this already. It means I could buy the Kellerman parcel that adjoins my east range. I've wanted that land for 4 years. It solves a water access problem of my own and adds 50% to my usable grazing. He paused. It means I could build a bunkhouse that isn't held together by stubbornness and old timber. Hire 2 more full hands and stop running a ranch built for 8 on the labor of 5. He paused again. It means a lot of things I've needed and told myself I'd manage without. And if you hold the easement conditional instead, the water rights guarantee, the terms you put to them at the council meeting, what do you get? I get what I can already live with. He said it without performance. That's not nothing. It's just less. Elowen looked at the land below them. Somewhere down there, invisible from this height, was the creek draw that the Halverson families had been using since before Arizona Territory had a proper boundary. Somewhere down there were 7 families who had built their operations around water they had not thought to formalize because it had always simply been there. It's your land, she said, and your decision. I want to be clear that I'm not standing here to make it for you. I know that. He turned to look at her. You came up here to tell me what was in the document. You've done that. Yes. She met his eyes. I also came up here because I thought you might want someone to stand here with you while you looked at it. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face, not gratitude exactly. Something more complicated and more private than that. Yeah, he said quietly. I did want that. They stood there for another few minutes without speaking, looking at the land, and it was not an uncomfortable silence or a romantic one. It was simply the silence of 2 people who have gotten past the point of needing to fill space with words and have arrived at the easier and rarer thing, which is being able to think in the same place. Vance came to the boarding house the following morning. Mrs. Callahan told Bram afterward that the man had been very polite, very professional, and had left a card in a sealed envelope when Bram wasn't in his room. She said this with the particular tone of a woman who has been polite in return and found it effortful. The envelope contained a number. Bram looked at it for a moment. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket and went to chop wood behind the boarding house, which was not something Mrs. Callahan had asked him to do, but which she had not objected to in the 2 weeks he'd been doing it. Physical work when he needed to think. He'd learned that about himself somewhere in the Kansas years, when thinking without moving had produced mostly bad decisions. He was halfway through the stack when Carl Halverson's youngest son came running across the yard with a message his father needed to see Bram. Quickly, something had happened on the North Corridor. What had happened was a survey crew. The Prescott Development Group, moving at a pace that suggested confidence in the eventual outcome, had sent a team to begin preliminary survey work on the northern approach on land that was technically territorial but adjacent to South Meadow and directly affecting the creek draw. They had arrived at dawn with equipment and authority letters and had begun staking claims along the creek bank before any of the farming families had finished their morning work. By the time Bram arrived at the Halverson North pasture, there were 4 families gathered at the fence line, and the mood was somewhere between alarmed and furious. Margaret Finch was already there, which surprised him, until he remembered that she had brothers in this corridor. She was standing with her arms crossed, and her jaw set in the manner of a woman who has moved past alarm directly into calculation. The survey crew chief was a young man named Foster, who was doing his job with the focused misery of someone who had been sent somewhere difficult and knew it. Carl Halverson was talking to him in the measured tone of a man who is being very careful not to shout. Those stakes you put on the south bank of the draw that's 5 feet from my fence line. I've had access to that bank for 31 years. I understand, sir, Foster said. This is preliminary survey work only. It doesn't establishes that someone drew a line, Carl said. And lines have a way of becoming permanent once someone's paid for them. Bram walked up to the fence line. Foster looked at him with the expression of a man hoping for someone rational to talk to and not being certain he'd found one. What's the scope of the survey? Bram asked. Northern approach corridor, secondary water access assessment, and easement boundary marking, Foster said. Standard preliminary work before a development agreement is finalized. Has a development agreement been finalized? Foster hesitated. Not to my knowledge. Then you're surveying land for an agreement that doesn't exist yet, on a corridor that passes through a privately held parcel South Meadow, without any easement arranged. Bram kept his voice level. Does your authority letter cover South Meadow? Another hesitation, longer this time. The survey scope covers the corridor approach. That's not what I asked. Foster pulled out the authority letter and read it. A genuine read, not a performance. The young man actually looked uncertain. The letter specifies territorial lands and corridor approaches, he said finally. It doesn't specify South Meadow by name. Then I'd suggest stopping the creek bank work until the agreement situation is clarified, Bram said. Because if the final easement conditions require guaranteed water access for these families, those stakes on the south bank may need to come out anyway. And it'll be cleaner for everyone if you haven't done work that has to be undone. Foster looked at the gathered families, looked at Bram, looked at Margaret Finch, who was looking at him with an expression that would have stopped a braver man. "I'll contact our office," he said. "We'll pause the Creek Bank portion pending clarification." "Thank you," Bram said. He didn't smile or make a thing of it. He just turned back to Carl, who was watching him with the appraising look of a man updating his estimate of another man's competence. "That'll hold him today," Carl said quietly. "Won't hold the company." "No. But today is what we needed." Bram looked at the stakes along the bank, 6 of them, bright new wood against the dark soil. "Has anyone contacted Elowen? She'll be at the store this morning." "Somebody should go. She'll want to know before she reads about it somewhere else." Margaret Finch was already turning toward her horse. The community meeting that Elowen called for that evening was not formally a town council session. She didn't have authority to convene an emergency council without Bellamy's consent, and Bellamy was in Tucson until Thursday. It was simply a meeting, families, merchants, anyone with a stake in what the development company was doing and where it was doing it. 17 people showed up. The Halversons, the Finches, 3 other farming families, Pete Dundas the farrier, 2 other merchants from the South End, and a handful of others who had heard the word survey and understood instinctively what that word cost when it arrived before you'd finished negotiating. Elowen stood at the front of the meeting room with the Vance document and her own annotated notes and a hand-drawn map of the corridor that she'd spent the previous evening updating. She explained the situation without minimizing it and without exaggerating it, which was the thing Bram had come to understand was her particular gift. She gave people exactly the information they needed to make real decisions, not the version that made her position easier or made the problem more manageable seeming than it was. "The development company is moving ahead, as if the agreement is essentially done," she said. "The survey crew this morning is the clearest signal of that. They expected to have South Meadow resolved and the council's agreement in hand before the month was out." She paused. "They may still expect that. We need to be clear about whether that expectation is correct." Tom Bellamy's deputy, a young man named Hicks, who was there in a listening capacity and had no voting authority, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "What we need," said a woman named Rose Dunbar, who ran the northernmost family operation and had the most immediate stake in the creek draw, "is to know what the sticking point actually is. Is it the water terms? Is it South Meadow? Both, Elowen said. "Independently, either one is negotiable. Together they give us the ability to insist on terms that are real rather than cosmetic." She looked around the room. "The question is whether we hold them together." "What does that cost us?" Carl Halverson asked. "If we push them hard and they walk away from Red Willow entirely?" "The railroad finds another route," Elowen said. "Slower and more expensive, but not impossible. We lose the revenue the railway connection would bring." She let that sit for a moment. "We also keep our water and our land use and our ability to make decisions about our own corridor. Those aren't small things either." The room was quiet with the specific quality of people doing mental accounting. Rose Dunbar said, "What do you think we should do?" "I think we should hold both conditions," Elowen said. "I think the company wants this route badly enough to accept real terms if we don't move. But I want everyone in this room to make that decision with clear eyes, not because I've convinced you of something." She paused. "I've been wrong about negotiations before. The Bradford situation 2 years ago, I pushed when I should have found a middle ground, and it cost us 6 months. I'm not telling you I'm certain here. That kind of honesty from a meeting leader tends to produce either panic or trust, and it produced trust because the people in that room had known Elowen Mercer long enough to know that she did not say she was uncertain unless she was genuinely uncertain and had thought hard about it anyway. Bram was sitting near the back. He had not spoken. Elowen had not asked him to speak, which he'd understood was deliberate. This was the community's meeting, and his ownership of South Meadow was a card already on the table. And adding his voice to the argument would have shifted the weight of it in a way that wasn't fair to anyone trying to decide freely. But Carl Halverson turned to look at him. "Callow, what's your read?" Bram felt the room turn with Carl. He sat with it for a moment, because he'd learned that the pause before answering was not weakness. It was the difference between saying something true and saying something that sounded true. "I think they walk away from Red Willow for about 3 weeks," he said. "Then they come back. Because the alternative route is expensive enough that they're going to feel it in their quarterly numbers. And that changes things at the level where decisions actually get made." He paused. "That's not certainty. It's a read based on having dealt with development money in New Mexico. The math is similar. And if you're wrong? Someone asked. Then we handled ourselves with integrity and built a better fence, Bram said. That's worth something on its own. The room shifted, not dramatically, but the way a room shifts when the argument has found its proper shape. The vote, informal as it was, came out 15-2 in favor of holding both conditions. Vance came back on Thursday when Bellamy had returned from Tucson, and the council was properly convened. He came with a third set of documents, and the manner of a man who has been on the telephone with people above his pay grade and has received new instructions. He presented a revised figure for South Meadow, not an outright purchase price this time, but an easement fee that was structured as a long-term payment arrangement. The number was different, but the structure was the same. Get access to the land, manage the terms over time, shape the conditions as circumstances evolved. Elowen read the easement language while Vance presented. Then she passed it to Bellamy, who read the first 2 pages and passed it back with the expression of a man who had found something he didn't like and wasn't sure where. Section 4, Elowen said, the renegotiation trigger. If the company's usage of the corridor increases beyond a certain threshold, which they define the easement terms open for renegotiation. On their timeline, not ours, Vance nodded smoothly. That's a standard provision to account for growth. It's also how you change the water access terms after the agreement is signed and our leverage is gone. She set the document down. We've seen this structure before, Mr. Vance. Miss Mercer, the council's position is unchanged, Bellamy said. It was the first time he'd led from the front on this, and the room noticed. Even Crawford noticed. And Crawford had spent the last 3 weeks wanting to find a middle ground that let everyone feel good about an agreement that had a structural problem. Permanent water access rights, county recorded, not subject to renegotiation. Mr. Callow's easement conditions, as stated at the original meeting. Vance looked at Bellamy, then at Elowen, then at the room. I'll need to contact our principals, he said. You've 10 days, Elowen said. We'll be here. After the meeting, Crawford caught Elowen's arm in the hallway, not aggressively, just the touch of a man who wants to talk before she's gone. You're sure they come back, he said. Quietly. So it was just the 2 of them. No, Elowen said. I'm sure that if we compromise now, we'll regret what we accepted. That's a different kind of certainty. Crawford chewed on that. Bellamy surprised me today. Bellamy reads the room, Elowen said. It's why he got elected twice. Crawford almost smiled. And the rancher. Callow, you trust him? She looked at Crawford steadily. I trust his word, and I trust his accounting of his own self-interest. That's as much as I trust anyone in a negotiation. Crawford looked at her. That's not what I meant. I know what you meant, Elowen said, and I'm not answering that question in a council hallway. The 10 days were tense in the specific way of Red Willow, under a waiting period, everyone continuing their ordinary work while carrying the weight of an outcome that hadn't resolved itself yet. The farming families checked their creek access daily with the slight hyper-awareness of people who've been reminded that something they take for granted could be taken. The merchants discussed it in the way of people running numbers in their heads that they haven't finished running yet. The survey crew had pulled its equipment from the creek bank and hadn't returned, which was either a good sign or a sign that they were letting the silence do work. On the 7th day, Rose Dunbar came to the store. She came in the late afternoon, when the light was going golden and the store was quiet, and she stood at the counter for a moment before she said anything. I want to ask you something personal, she said to Elowen. All right, the rancher, Callow. Roz looked at the counter, then at Elowen. He's holding South Meadow the way you'd hold a card for someone else to play. And he's not asking for anything for it. No, Elowen said. He's not. In my experience, Rose said, men who don't ask for anything are either saints or they're waiting for the moment to ask for something so large it can't be refused. Elowen was quiet for a moment. Which do you think he is? I think he's something in between, Roz said, which is the only kind that's actually interesting. She paused. And I think you've been watching him long enough to have an opinion. I have an opinion, Elowen said. I'm still examining it. Rose looked at her with the frank expression of a woman who has known Elowen Mercer for 15 years and has a good sense of when she's being given the careful version of an answer. Fair enough, she said. I just wanted to say whatever you decide about him, it's not about the land. People can see that. People see what they want to see, Elowen said. Sometimes Rose picked up her gloves, and sometimes they see what's actually there. After Rose left, Elowen stood at the counter for a moment. Then she went to the back room where Silas was doing his late afternoon accounts. He looked up when she came in. He read her face the way he'd been reading it for 30 years, and he said, "Sit down." She sat. "Tell me what you're actually thinking," Silas said. "Not the negotiation version." She looked at her father. He was smaller than he'd been when she was young. She'd been noticing that more lately, the way age compressed him, the careful way he held his bad hip, the slight tremor in his hands that he pretended not to have. It made her chest hurt in a way she'd learned to carry without saying. "I'm thinking," she said slowly, "that I've spent a great deal of energy in the last 20 years deciding not to want the things I actually want." Silas set his pen down. "I decided that waiting for Bram was foolish, and I was right about that. I decided that a man's promise didn't mean anything, and I was right about that too in the general case." She looked at her hands. "But I've been applying the general case to a specific person, and I'm not sure the fit is as clean as I've been telling myself." "He's not a general case," Silas said. "No, he never was." Her father looked at her with the steady attention of a man who has something to say and is choosing how to say it carefully. "When you were 10 and he was 10, I watched the two of you argue about the proper way to stack crates for 45 minutes. You were both entirely wrong and both absolutely certain." He paused. "I thought then that whoever that boy became, he'd be worth watching." Elowen looked at him. "You never said that. You were 10. What was I going to say?" She was quiet for a moment. She stopped. Started again. "If this goes wrong, I don't recover from it the way I recovered from the other things. That's the honest calculation." Silas was quiet. "The others I turned away, I never really wanted them. The loss was theoretical. With Bram," she stopped again. "With Bram, it's already real," Silas said. "That's what you're saying." She didn't answer. Which was its own answer. Silas picked up his pen again. "Elowen, I've been managing this store since before you were born, and in that time I've made exactly 2 decisions I'm genuinely proud of. The first was marrying your mother." He wrote something in the ledger without looking at her. "The second was teaching you that the right kind of caution and the wrong kind of caution look identical from the outside, and only the person in the middle knows the difference." She sat with that for a long moment. Then she got up, went back to the front of the store, and stood at the window looking at the main street of Red Willow, in the evening light, the buildings she'd known since she was a child, the road she'd walked every day for 30 years. The particular quality of the light at this hour that she had never quite seen anywhere else, and suspected she never would. Bram was coming down the street. She could see him from the window, the familiar shape of him now, after 5 weeks, the way he moved. He was carrying something from the hardware store down the block, and he hadn't seen her yet. He stopped in the middle of the street to let a wagon pass, and while he was waiting, he looked up at the sky in the way of a man simply taking a moment, not performing it for anyone, not aware of being watched. Just a man in a street, looking at the evening. She watched him. And somewhere inside Sarah's chest, the last careful lock she'd been maintaining for 20 years, turned over with a sound she'd been half expecting for weeks. She did not go out to him, not yet. She still had a negotiation to finish, and a council to manage, and a father to care for, and 17 other things that were real and mattered. But she stood at the window a moment longer, and she let herself know what she knew, and stopped telling herself the examination wasn't done. The examination was done. She just needed the situation to catch up with the conclusion. On the 9th day, Vance sent a message to Bellamy rather than appearing in person. The message indicated that the Prescott Development Group wished to schedule a formal negotiation session with all relevant parties, including the owner of South Meadow, to discuss a revised agreement structure. It was not capitulation. Not yet. But it was the opening Elowen had said would come, and it came 1 day earlier than the deadline, which told her what she needed to know about how the quarterly numbers were looking. She sent Bram the message with a single line added in her own hand, "They're coming back." He sent it back with 2 words, "I know." And beneath that, in handwriting that was not quite as steady as the rest, a 3rd word, "Good." She folded the note and put it in the tin box with the hail letter and the ownership documents and all the other things that mattered enough to keep. That evening she walked to the cottonwood without planning to. She stood under it for a while in the dark, not thinking about the negotiation or the council or the development agreement. Just standing there, just knowing what she knew. The bark was rough under her hand, old and permanent, and somewhere in it their initials were still there, like a question that had taken 20 years to find the right moment for an answer. She wasn't ready to answer it out loud yet, but she was done pretending she didn't know what the answer was. The formal negotiation session was held on a Friday morning in the council chambers, and Aldous Vance arrived with 2 associates this time instead of 1, which Elowen read correctly as a sign that the people above him had decided this required more presence and less finesse. She arrived with Bram's ownership documentation, her own annotated version of every proposal the company had submitted, and a hand-copied transcript of the water access clause as it had appeared in each successive draft, 3 versions, side by side, showing exactly how the language had shifted and where it had stayed stubbornly the same underneath the new wording. She had stayed up until past midnight preparing it, and her eyes felt it, and she had told no one. Bellamy opened the session. Crawford sat beside him, with the careful posture of a man who had decided to let this play out and reserve his opinion until it was clear which way things were settling. Hicks took notes. The 3 farming families most directly affected sat in the observer chairs along the wall: Rose Dunbar, Carl Halverson, and a quiet man named Edgar Pruitt, who had not said more than 30 words at any public meeting in the 6 years Elowen had known him, but who had brought his own copy of the proposed agreement and had marked it in 3 places with careful pencil notations. Vance presented the new structure with the manner of a man who has been told to be less smooth and more direct, and is doing his professional best with that instruction. The new proposal dropped the Corridor Development Authority, entirely the board structure that had given the company renegotiation leverage over time. The water access language was changed to permanent guaranteed access, county recorded, with no renegotiation trigger. The room was quiet when he finished. Elowen looked at the document. She read the relevant sections twice, comparing them against her transcripts from the previous versions. Then she looked at Vance. "The easement fee structure for South Meadow," she said. Section 7. "The annual payment is indexed to corridor usage volume, defined by your company's reported figures." Vance nodded. "That's standard for usage-based easement arrangements. It means your company controls the number that determines what Mr. Callow receives each year." She kept her voice even. "I'd want that indexed to an independent measure, Territorial Commerce Office figures, or a jointly appointed assessor." Vance looked at his associates. Something passed between them, not alarm, but the look of people who had anticipated this exact point and had been told how far they could go. "An independent assessor would be acceptable," Vance said. "Jointly appointed, costs split." Bellamy wrote something. Crawford looked up from his notepad. "The county recording of the water rights," Elowen continued. "I want that completed before any ground is broken. Not after. Not concurrent, before. We can agree to that," Vance said. "Provided the easement agreement is signed within 30 days of today." 20 days, Elowen said. Vance paused. 25. Elowen looked at Bellamy. Bellamy nodded once. 25 days, she said. They worked through the document for 2 more hours. It was not dramatic work. It was the detailed grinding work of 2 parties, checking every sentence against their own interests and finding the language that neither side could later claim was ambiguous. Elowen made 7 more changes. Vance accepted 4 outright, modified 2, and held firm on 1, a clause about maintenance responsibility for the easement road that she ultimately decided was not worth the fight. When it was over, Vance gathered his papers with the composed expression of a man who has lost less than he expected to lose and is recalculating accordingly. "We'll have a clean draft to you within 3 days, he said. "We'll review it within 2 after that," Elowen said. After the room cleared, Bellamy stayed behind. He sat at the council table looking at his notes for a moment, then looked at Elowen. "The Development Authority removal," he said. "That was the key one. That was the one that would have cost the families everything within 10 years, she said. "Everything else was negotiable." "I know," he paused. "I should have seen it in the first draft." "You saw it when it mattered," she said. "That's what counts." Bellamy looked at his notes again. Then he said, without looking up, "The rancher. He gave up a lot. He gave up an expansion he said he didn't need. Most men say they don't need the thing they'd trade everything for." Bellamy looked up. "He meant it." "Yes," Elowen said. "He did." Bellamy held her gaze for a moment with the look of a man who has something to say that is outside his professional lane and is deciding whether to say it anyway. He decided against it and stood up instead. "Good work, Elowen." She nodded. She was already thinking about what came next. What came next was Orson Pike, which she had not entirely expected, though perhaps should have. He came to the store the following morning, a Saturday, which meant the store was busy and she was moving between the counter and the back room, and didn't have the ease of a quiet conversation. He waited. He was patient in the way of a man who has decided what he needs to say and is not going to leave until he's said it. When the store quieted around mid-morning, he came to the counter. "I heard the negotiation went well," he said. "Well enough." She was tallying receipts. "The draft comes in 3 days." "Good." He was quiet for a moment. "Elowen," she looked up. He was not wearing his badge. She noticed that specifically he had it most days, the way most marshals kept their office on them as a matter of habit. Today it was not there. He was just a man in a clean shirt standing at a counter. "I put in for the territorial marshal position," he said. "Out of Prescott. Covers 4 counties bigger work, more complicated situations." He paused. "I've been thinking about it for a while." The timing seemed right. She set down her pencil. "When did you hear?" 3 days ago. "They offered it to me." He met her eyes. "I'm going to take it." She looked at him for a moment. "Is that what you want?" "Not what makes sense." "What you want." Something moved across his face, the unexpected quality of someone asking the right question at an unexpected moment. "Yes," he said. "It's what I want. Red Willow's been good to me. But I've been small in it." He paused. "I've done things in the last 2 months that I'm not proud of. You know what they are. I know what they are. A bigger place might give me room to be a better version of myself." Elowen was quiet for a moment. "I think that's honest." "It is." He picked up his hat from the counter. "I owe you an apology that's cleaner than the one I gave you before. The Santa Fe business. The ranch hand story. I knew both were unfair when I used them, and I used them anyway because I was—" He stopped. "I was afraid. Not of him. Of what it would mean if you chose him." She looked at him steadily. "Orson, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I just need to have said it plainly, without the conversation being about the negotiation or the water rights or anything else. Just this." He paused. "I handled myself badly, I'm sorry." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had kept Red Willow orderly for 9 years, who had intervened in 3 dangerous situations she knew of personally, and probably more she didn't, who had made himself smaller by wanting something he couldn't have, and trying to protect that want with tactics that didn't suit him. "I accept it," she said, plainly and without conditions. He nodded. Something settled in him visibly, the way tension settles when a thing has been properly finished. "He's a good man," Orson said. He said it without drama, the way you say something when you've been fighting it long enough that it's finally arrived at just being true. "I didn't want to think so, but he is." "I know," Elowen said. Orson put his hat on, straightened it. "Take care of yourself. And Silas." He paused at the door. "If the Prescott position doesn't suit me, I'll probably be back through here in a year or 2. Red Willow will still be here," she said. He smiled genuine, a little worn, the smile of a man making peace with something. Then he went out, and the bell above the door said its usual word, and he was gone. Elowen stood at the counter for a moment. Then she picked up her pencil and went back to the receipts, and her handwriting was steadier than she expected it to be. She told Bram about it that evening, on the back porch, while Silas dozed in his chair near the window, with the particular completeness of a man who has eaten a good supper and has no urgent concerns. Bram listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Where's he going?" he asked. "Prescott. Territorial marshal. 4 counties. Bram looked at the yard. "He'll be good at it. He's better at order than he is at wanting things he can't have." He paused. "Most people are." Elowen looked at him. "Are you?" He glanced at her. "I don't know yet. I haven't had much practice at having what I want." He said it without self-pity, just as a factual accounting. "Most of the last 20 years has been about building something I could stand behind, not about what came after. And now?" He turned to look at her properly. The evening light was behind her, and he looked at her the way he sometimes looked at a problem he was trying to solve with full attention and without hurry. "Now I'm learning," he said. The porch was quiet. Somewhere inside, Silas shifted in his chair and murmured something in his sleep that wasn't a word. "My father is getting older," Elowen said. It came out simply, without decoration, the way she said things that were hard. "His hip is worse than he admits. His hands shake in the mornings. He's been managing the account books more slowly this fall than last." She paused. "He would never ask me to stay for his sake. He'd rather I thought it was my own choice." "Is it?" She considered that. "It's both. I'm not going to pretend that's not complicated. I'm not asking you to." Bram leaned against the porch post with his arms crossed, not crowding her, not making the conversation about himself. "I've been thinking about something." "Tell me." "Silas doesn't have to stay in Red Willow either." She looked at him. Juniper Crown has a proper house, he said. It's not large, but it has a separate room. Silas could have his own space. There are no stairs to manage on the main level, and the climate in that part of New Mexico is easier on joints than Arizona dust. He paused. The ranch needs someone with his accounting skill. I pay Delford Harris extra to do books he's not suited for because I haven't found anyone better. Silas could do that work from a chair with a cup of coffee, and it would be a legitimate contribution, not charity. Elowen was very still. I'm not presenting this as a solution, Bram said carefully. I know it doesn't solve everything. It doesn't solve the store, or the families here that you've built connections with, or the council position, or any of the other 20 reasons you have roots in this place. He held her gaze. But I'm not willing to ask you to choose between me and your father. That's not a choice I'm willing to put in front of you. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that the silence had several different qualities in it before she spoke. You've been thinking about this for a while, she said, since the third week. She stopped. That's before the South Meadow situation, before any of the negotiation. Yes, you weren't holding it back as a card. No. He met her eyes directly. I didn't say it because I wasn't sure of the idea yet. I wanted to think through whether it was real or whether I was just trying to solve a problem in a way that suited me. He paused. It's real. Elowen turned away from him and looked at the yard. She needed a moment that he was not in the center of, because the thing happening in her chest was large enough that she needed to stand beside it briefly before she could speak again. She thought about her father's hands on the ledger. She thought about Silas saying the right kind of caution and the wrong kind look identical from the outside. She thought about standing at the store window, watching Bram in the street, looking at the evening sky, not knowing he was watched. She thought about 30 years of Red Willow and what it had given her and what it had cost her, and what, honestly, she would miss if she left and what she would not. I'd want to talk to my father, she said, not present it to him as a plan. Talk to him. That's the right way to do it, Bram said. And I'd want to see Juniper Crown before any decision is made. Not because I don't trust your account of it, because I need to know a place before I can decide about it. That's also the right way. And the store. She turned back to him. I'd want to see it in the right hands before it closes to us. Not sold to anyone who'll run it badly. What would right hands look like? Someone who knows inventory, who understands supply negotiation, who won't let Delbert Haynes bill them for 48 sacks when 39 arrive. She paused. There's a young man named Will Carey who's been working the hardware store for 3 years and has been asking questions about general merchandise for 2 of them. I've been watching him. Bram almost smiled. You've been thinking about this too. I've been thinking about a lot of things, she said. I told you the examination was still running. I didn't say nothing was coming out of it. He looked at her with that expression she'd been cataloging for weeks, the one that appeared when she said something that landed somewhere specific in him. He didn't perform anything with it. He just let it be there. Elowen, he said, what do you want? Not what's practical, not what takes care of everyone. What do you want for yourself? The question sat in the air between them with more weight than its words. She had spent so long being good at this, at absorbing the question of what she wanted into the larger question of what was right and what was sustainable, and what didn't put her at risk of a loss she couldn't recover from. She had gotten very efficient at it, almost automatic. She looked at him. This man with his gray eyes and his 20 years of becoming, and his particular quality of stillness that was not passivity, but something harder won. This man who had held South Meadow like a card he had no intention of playing for his own benefit, who had thought about her father before she'd asked him to, who had watched her teach children and noticed that she was harder on herself than on any of them. I want to stop being so careful, she said. It came out quieter than she intended. I want to stop running the accounting on everything I feel before I let myself feel it. She paused. I want to go to sleep somewhere that isn't a room above this store and wake up somewhere that I chose because I wanted it, not because it was the responsible thing. She looked at him steadily. And I want you in that somewhere. That's the honest answer. Bram was quiet. I've known that for a while, she said. I was finishing the examination. You said take whatever time I needed. I did, he said. I'm done taking it. He crossed the porch in 2 steps and she stood her ground, and when he put his hands on either side of her face, they were rough and careful at the same time. The hands of a man who works hard and knows the difference between the things you hold firmly and the things you hold gently. He looked at her for one moment, just looked, The way you look at something before you trust it completely. And then he kissed her. It was not a perfect kiss. She had flour residue on her collar, and he had a sunburned nose, and she made a small, undignified sound of surprise even though she'd known it was coming, and neither of them cared at all. Silas, inside by the window, opened one eye. He closed it again. He was smiling when he did. Will Carey was 26 and had an accountant's mind and a merchant's body, and had been watching Mercer's general store for long enough that when Elowen asked him to come in for a conversation, he arrived, with a notepad and 3 questions already prepared. They talked for 2 hours. Elowen walked him through the supply contracts, the invoice system she developed, the seasonal ordering patterns, the particular challenges of the Red Willow market, which suppliers were reliable, which needed watching, which would try to short a delivery if they thought you weren't counting. Will took notes with focused intensity and asked the right questions in the right order, which told her more than the answers did. At the end of it, he set the notepad down. "What are you asking for it?" She gave him a number. He looked at it. "That's fair," he said. "More than fair. It's the right number," Elowen said. "Not a favor price. The right number for what the business actually produces." She paused. "Silas built it and I ran it for 7 years. I want it sold correctly, not cheap." "I'd need financing," Will said, "the territorial bank." "They'll do it. I know your record. They'll do it." She looked at him steadily. "The store has a reputation in Red Willow. That reputation is part of what you're buying. Don't let Delbert Haynes sell you short on flour shipments." Will almost smiled. "I've heard about Haynes. Everyone's heard about Haynes. That doesn't mean everyone knows how to handle him." She slid a piece of paper across the desk, her notes on every supplier, their reliability ratings, their particular pressure points. "This is what I know. It's yours." He looked at the paper, then at her. "Why are you leaving? If it's all right to ask." "It's all right to ask." She thought about how to answer it honestly. "I built something good here, and I'm going somewhere to build something else. That's the full account." Will nodded slowly. "Where?" "New Mexico. A ranch." He considered that. "With the rancher who's been fixing the loading dock." "With the rancher who's been fixing the loading dock," she confirmed. Will looked at his notepad. Something passed across his young face, not judgment. Something more like the careful filing away of information by someone who is watching how a person he respects makes a major decision and intends to learn from it. "I'll go to the bank Monday," he said. "Good." She stood and extended her hand. He shook it firmly, the way she'd taught him without knowing she was teaching him, by doing it that way herself every time. Telling Silas was the conversation she had expected to be hardest, and that turned out to be something else entirely. She sat across from him at the kitchen table that Sunday morning with coffee between them, and she told him plainly the store, Will Carey, the plan, Juniper Crown, the room on the main level with no stairs, the account books that needed someone who could do them properly. Silas listened to all of it with the careful attention of a man who is trying to determine how much of this he already knew. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Juniper Crown," he said. "New Mexico. Southern Range." He describes it as, "I know what he's told me about it," Silas said. "I've been listening to the man for 6 weeks. I know the creek and the East Pasture problem, and Delford Harris and the bunkhouse that needs rebuilding." He paused. "I've been thinking about whether the altitude would help my hip." Elowen stared at him. "How long have you been thinking about this?" "Since about week 3. He picked up his coffee. The young Carey boy came in asking smart questions about supply contracts. I thought then he might be right for the store. "You knew I was thinking about leaving." "I knew you were thinking about something," Silas said. "You have a look when you're working out a large problem. You've had it since you were about 8. He set the cup down. "I want to be useful, Elowen. That's all I've ever wanted after your mother died. I'm not useful, sitting in this chair watching a store that you're running better than I ever could." He looked at her steadily. "If there's work to do at this ranch, real work, not charity, then that's worth going for." She had promised herself she would not do this. She did it anyway. Her eyes went full, and she pressed her lips together and looked at the table for a moment. "Don't," Silas said, not unkindly. "I'm not, you are." "I'm not going to apologize for it," she said, which made him laugh, which made her laugh through the full eyes, which was the way they had always gotten through things. "Ask the man to come to supper tonight," Silas said when they'd settled. "I want to tell him myself that we're coming. He'll say it's not necessary." "I know it's not necessary," Silas said. "I want to say it anyway. An old man is allowed some theater." Bram came to supper. Silas told him directly, over salt pork and cornbread, that he'd be coming to New Mexico with his daughter if Bram had no objection to an old man who could keep books and had opinions about the proper way to store grain. Bram said he had no objection at all. Silas said good, and passed the cornbread, and that was that. After supper, while Silas settled into his chair, Bram and Elowen walked. They did not go toward the cottonwood this time. They went the other direction, toward the north end of town, past the Halverson fence line, and along the road that led toward the ridge. The night was clear, and the stars were the particular brightness of high desert country, and the air had the first hint of autumn in it. The draft agreement came today, Elowen said. I reviewed it this afternoon. It's clean. I saw the messenger at the store, I figured. The independent assessor language is in. The county recording before groundbreaking is in. The development authority is gone. She paused. It's a fair agreement. It's better than fair, Bram said. It's what those families needed. She glanced at him. You're not calculating what you gave up. I know what I gave up. He walked with his hands in his coat pockets, unhurried. I also know what I'm keeping. He paused. The Kellerman parcel is still something I'll try for eventually. With time and the right season. I don't need it this year. Next year might be better timing, Elowen said. Might be. They walked in the comfortable quiet that had become the texture of being together, not silence born of having nothing to say, but the silence of two people who have said enough that the spaces between words are full rather than empty. After a while, Elowen said, The council is meeting next Tuesday to ratify the agreement. I'll be there for the ratification, and then I'm done. Done? Done with the council seat. I'll stand through the end of the month for the transition. But whoever replaces me, they should be someone who's staying. She looked at the road ahead. Margaret Finch, maybe. She understands what the northern families need, and she's more patient than she looks. She's more patient than everyone looks, Bram said. That's probably the right person for a council seat. Elowen paused. I've been thinking about what I want to do at Juniper Crown. Beyond the books, beyond the ranch management. Tell me, the ranch families. Do they have children? He thought about it. Delford Harris has 2. The Reyes family who works the south pasture have 3. Couple of others, seasonal workers mostly, but some have families nearby. Are their schools accessible? There's a schoolhouse in the nearest town. 4 miles. It's inconsistent teacher turnover, funding issues. He looked at her. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that a schoolroom on the ranch property, not formal, not official, just a place with books and a schedule, serves the children who can't reliably make 4 miles. She paused. I've been teaching the Halverson children, and the Dupree children, and the O'Brien boy for 3 years on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. I know how to do it. I know what's needed. Bram was quiet for a moment. Then, the room at the east end of the house. I've been using it for storage. It has good light in the morning. She turned to look at him. We'd need proper desks, he said. Bookshelves. I know what lumber costs. I know what books cost, she said. They looked at each other on the dark road. And the thing that passed between them was not romantic in any theatrical sense. It was the specific warmth of two people discovering that what they each are fits together into something larger than either is separately. The kind of fit that's not dramatic, because it doesn't need to be. It's just true. I want to see it, she said. Juniper Crown. Before any of it is settled. We can go in 3 weeks, he said. After the agreement is ratified and the store transition is underway. 3 weeks, she said. All right, he reached out and took her hand on the road. Not a gesture, just a thing he did, naturally, without staging it. Her hand was not soft. She worked too hard for soft, and his was rougher than hers. And they fit together imperfectly in the way of hands that have spent decades doing different kinds of work and are only just learning to hold the same thing. They turned and walked back toward Red Willow. The town was lit in the way of small frontier places at night, warm light from windows. A horse shifting somewhere. The clean dark sky overhead doing what high desert sky does, which is be enormous and clear and indifferent to the smallness of what happens below it. But what happened below it wasn't small. It didn't feel small. Elowen held his hand and walked and thought about a schoolroom with good morning light, and a creek she hadn't seen yet, and a man who had spent 20 years becoming someone worth coming back to. And she thought about her father's face over the cornbread and relieved and trying not to show it. She thought about the cottonwood with their initials in it, and whether she would miss it, and decided that she would, and that missing something good was not the same as losing it. Bram, she said. Yeah. When you came back here when you rode in that first day and walked into the store, were you afraid? He was quiet long enough to be honest about it. Yes. Of what? That you'd be exactly what I remembered and exactly what I'd hoped, and you'd look at me and I'd be a stranger. He paused. That the 20 years would be the distance between us, instead of the reason I was worth knowing. She thought about that. And now? Now I think the 20 years are why it works, he said. Not because they made us perfect. Because they made us the specific imperfect people who might actually fit together. She thought about all the ways he was right and the few ways the full answer was still forming itself, and decided that was fine. Things didn't have to be fully formed to be true. You could know a thing was real before it was finished. Agreed, she said, and they walked home. The council ratified the agreement the following Tuesday, 12-0, with Crawford making the motion and Bellamy seconding it, which was not a thing anyone had predicted, but which felt, in the particular way of unexpected things that turn out to be right, like exactly how it should have gone. The county recorder filed the water access documentation on Thursday. Rose Dunbar was at the recorder's office when it was filed, because Rose Dunbar was not a woman who let important things happen without a witness, and she came directly to the store afterward and put her hands on Elowen's counter and said, "It's done. It's recorded." Elowen nodded. 30 years from now, Rose said, someone on that corridor is going to use that creek and they won't even know your name. That's how it should be, Elowen said. Roz looked at her. You're really leaving. I'm really leaving. Roz was quiet for a moment. Then she said, take care of Silas. He pretends his hip doesn't hurt. I know, and take care of yourself. Rose picked up her gloves. You've been taking care of other things for a long time. It's allowed to be your turn. Elowen watched her go, and stood in the store she had run for 7 years and let herself feel it, the full weight of leaving, and the full weight of going toward something, and the strange, not entirely comfortable truth that both could be real at once. The store smelled of sawdust and dried goods, and the faint iron of the old stove, and 20 years of her father's work and 7 years of her own. She knew every corner of it, every squeaking floorboard, every place where the light came through oddly in late afternoon. She was going to miss it. She was also, for the first time in a very long time, going somewhere she actually wanted to go. Those two things stood side by side in her chest, and she let them both be there, because she was done with the accounting, done with the careful management of what she allowed herself to feel. It was her turn. She had made her own choice, and the choice was exactly what she wanted. They left Red Willow on a Thursday morning, which was not a dramatic day for a departure, and was better for it. Will Carey had taken the keys to Mercer's General Store the previous Friday, following 3 days of Elowen walking him through every supplier relationship, every seasonal pattern, every particular piece of institutional knowledge that does not appear in any ledger, but lives in the mind of the person who has been doing the work. She had shown him where Delbert Haynes's invoices were filed separately from the others, and why, and he had written it down in his notepad with the focused seriousness of a young man who understands that he is receiving something that took years to build and intends to be worthy of it. On his last evening in the store, Silas had come down from the back room with the slow, careful management of his hip and stood behind the counter one final time. He had run his hand along the worn wood surface, not dramatically, not with the look of a man performing a farewell, but the way you touch something you made or kept with your hands when you're acknowledging that the keeping is done. Then he had straightened up and said to Will, the flower, "Count it yourself every time." "Yes, sir," Will said. "And the hinges," Elowen said. "I know about the hinges," Will said. Silas had laughed, and that was how they left it. On Thursday morning, they loaded 2 wagons, one for Silas and the household goods, one for Elowen's things, and a collection of books that took up more space than she'd planned and less than she'd feared. Bram had been ready before either of them, which surprised no one. He had spent the last 3 weeks settling accounts at the boarding house, returning borrowed tools, and doing the particular kind of quiet leave-taking of a man who understands that he came into a community and owes it a proper exit regardless of where he's going next. Mrs. Callahan had given him back a week's rent he hadn't asked for and told him to come through Red Willow if he ever had reason to, which was her version of warmth, and he accepted it as such. Carl Halverson and his brother came to see them off. Rose Dunbar came. Margaret Finch, who had already begun the process of considering the council seat that Elowen had vacated, came and stood straight-backed on the main street and said to Elowen, "I'll write." "I'll write back," Elowen said. "You better. I'll have questions about Crawford." "Crawford is manageable if you don't let him speak first on anything with a budget attached." Margaret almost smiled. Good to know there were no speeches. Elowen was grateful for that. She had been to enough frontier farewells to know that the ones with speeches were harder to leave, not because the words were moving, but because they went on too long and made everyone feel they needed to perform a grief proportional to the occasion. She did not want to perform anything. She wanted to go. She hugged Rose Dunbar, who was not a woman who hugged often and therefore hugged hard when she did. She shook Carl Halverson's hand and he held it for a moment and said, "You did right by those families. They know it even if they don't say it." She said goodbye to the other faces she had known for years, some of them her whole life, and she let herself feel what she felt without trying to manage the size of it. Then she climbed onto the wagon seat beside Bram, and Silas settled into the second wagon with the household goods, and they went. The cottonwood at the edge of the Mercer property passed on the left as they reached the south road. Elowen looked at it. The bark was dark in the morning light, and the crown moved in a small wind, and somewhere in the wood their initials were still there, would be there long after all of them were gone, which was both a small thing and not a small thing at all. She turned forward and did not look back again. That choice, the deliberate turning forward, was the last act of the careful woman she had been, and the first act of whoever she was becoming. The journey to Juniper Crown took 5 days, which was 2 days longer than it would have taken Bram alone, because the pace needed to account for Silas's comfort, and the wagon's load, and the fact that Elowen refused to drive the horses hard on the second day when the terrain roughened, and the older wagon showed signs of complaining. They camped 3 nights and spent 1 night at a way station, outside a small territorial town, where the beds were narrow and the food was salt-heavy and entirely adequate. Silas slept better than either of them had expected, which he attributed to the air, and which Elowen suspected was partly the relief of a man who has stopped pretending everything is fine and has simply committed to what comes next. On the road, they talked. Not constantly, there was a lot of terrain and a lot of quiet between conversations, which was its own kind of comfort, but they talked more freely than they had in Red Willow, where the town had always been slightly present at the edges of everything. Bram told her things he hadn't told her in the store or on the porch, not confessions, just the ordinary details of a life that she hadn't had occasion to ask about. The winter 3 years ago, when a disease had moved through his cattle herd, and he'd lost a quarter of his stock, and had spent 4 days thinking he was going to lose the ranch entirely. The way he'd gotten through it, which was not heroic, he'd made a list of what he still had, and worked through the list methodically, starting with water access, and ending with the fact that Delford Harris had not left during the worst of it, which was information about Delford that Bram considered more valuable than anything else about the man. "Did you think about giving up?" Elowen asked. They were on the 3rd day, moving through high scrub country, and the sky had the enormous quality of open land. "I thought about it for one evening," Bram said. "Then I decided thinking about it was expensive, and I couldn't afford the time." He was quiet for a moment. "I've learned that the decision to keep going doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like you just don't stop. One day follows another, and eventually you're past it." "That's not very romantic," Elowen said. "No," he glanced at her. "But it's true, which is worth more." She looked at the landscape. "The woman at the way station last night, she asked me if we were newlyweds." Bram waited. I said not yet. She said it without looking at him, with the particular quality of someone making a statement they have thought about carefully and are now making available without ceremony. He was quiet for a moment. "Not yet," he said. "Not yet," she confirmed. From the second wagon, Silas called out, "I can hear everything up there, you know." Bram looked straight ahead. Elowen covered her mouth. Neither of them said anything, which was the loudest possible response. Juniper Crown Ranch appeared first, as a line of cottonwoods along a creek, which Elowen noticed before anything else, the trees running along the land like a signature, marking water the way cottonwoods always did in dry country. Then the fence lines came into view, and the main structure of the house, and the outbuildings arranged with the practical logic of an man. Yunbad thought about where things needed it to be in relation to each other rather than how they would look. It was not a beautiful ranch in the way of places that have been arranged for beauty. It was a working ranch that had been built and added to over years, with evidence of both the years and the work visible in the fabric of it. The bunkhouse Bram had mentioned did in fact look like it was held together partly by stubbornness. The barn was solid. The main house had a porch that ran along the front, and one side which Elowen noted practically good shade, good air movement, a place where someone with a bad hip could sit with a cup of coffee and feel useful. Delford Harris came out of the barn when they pulled in. He was a broad, quiet man in his early 40s, with the economy of movement of someone who does physical work all day and has stopped wasting any of it. He looked at Bram, then at Elowen, then at Silas on the second wagon, and did the rapid assessment of a practical man encountering a new situation. "Delford," Bram said. "Boss." Delford looked at Elowen. "You must be Miss Mercer." "I am," she said. "He talked about you," Delford said. "Not warmly, not coldly, just factually. More than he thought he did." Bram said nothing, which Elowen filed away. Delford helped Silas down from the wagon with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who has helped people with physical limitations before and doesn't make anything of it. Silas thanked him and stood looking at the property with the expression he wore when he was doing his own accounting. "Where's the east pasture problem?" he asked Bram. Bram pointed. "That tree line. Creek runs behind it, and the Kellerman property starts on the other side." Silas looked. "Water access from this side?" "Seasonal. Dry months it's thin. You should put it in writing with Kellerman that you have access rights regardless, even if you never buy the parcel." Silas looked at Bram. "Handshake agreements disappear when the other party does." Bram looked at him. Then he said, "I know. I've been putting it off." "Stop putting it off." "Yes, sir." Elowen looked at the two of them, the older man who had just arrived and was already finding useful things to say, and the man she had come here with, who was receiving them without defensiveness. Something settled in her that had been slightly tense without her knowing it. The room at the east end of the house had good morning light. She had not doubted Bram's account of it, but seeing it herself was different. The light came through 2 windows and fell across the plank floor in long pale rectangles, and the room was large enough for 5 desks and a proper bookshelf, and the ceiling was solid and the walls were sound. She stood in it for a few minutes while the men unloaded the wagons. She thought about the O'Brien boy working through his vowels. She thought about the Halverson children and the way the older one pretended not to care about reading until she found the right book, and then cared so much he finished it in 3 evenings. She thought about the ranch families here, Delford's 2 children, the Reyes family's 3, the others Bram had mentioned, and what 4 miles of uncertain road to an inconsistent schoolhouse actually cost a child across the course of a year. Not very much, maybe, if every day was fine. Everything, potentially, if enough days weren't. She went out and found Bram by the barn. "The room is good," she said. "I thought it would be. I want proper desks, not makeshift. If it's going to be a school, it should look like one, so the children take it seriously." She paused. "And a proper blackboard. Chalk is cheap, a blackboard lasts 20 years. I know a carpenter in town," Bram said. "He does good work. I'll go see him this week." He looked at her with an expression she'd been cataloging for months, and still found she couldn't reduce to a single word. Pride was part of it, but that wasn't right. Exactly, it was more like recognition, the look of someone watching a thing become what it always had the capacity to be. She didn't say anything about the expression. She was learning to let it be there. "Delford wants to show you the creek this afternoon," Bram said. "The main channel. He has opinions about the bank reinforcement." "He has opinions about everything," Elowen said. "He does. They're usually right. Then I'll go look at the creek." The weeks that followed were not easy in the sense of effortless. They were the kind of weeks that are full in every direction tasks that needed doing, people that needed learning, land that needed understanding. Elowen had known how to run a general store through long accumulated practice. She did not know how to understand a cattle ranch, and she approached not knowing it the same way she'd approached every other gap in her knowledge, which was to work at it systematically and ask questions without embarrassment. Delford Harris was a surprisingly patient teacher when the person asking questions was clearly not going to waste his time. He showed her the creek channel and the east pasture and the grazing rotation schedule and the reasons behind it, and he explained them once clearly and didn't explain them again, which she appreciated, because it meant he thought she was capable of remembering. She remembered. She asked a follow-up question about the dry month water thinning that Delford had not considered from her angle, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Huh," which she understood to mean she had been accepted. Silas settled into the account books within his first week and found 3 places where Bram's record-keeping system was creating unnecessary confusion, not dishonesty, just the accumulated imprecision of a man who was better at ranching than at paperwork and knew it. Silas restructured the system over 10 days with the focused satisfaction of a man applying as he spent 40 years sharpening. When he showed Bram the reorganized ledger, Bram looked at it for a long time and said, "I could always find the numbers. I just couldn't always find them fast." "Now you can find them fast," Silas said. "That's what accounts are for." "Yes, sir." Silas's hip was better in the New Mexico air. Not fixed, it would never be fixed. But the particular quality of the dry warmth at this elevation suited it in a way that Arizona dust never had. And he sat on the porch in the evenings, with his coffee and the mountains in the distance, and the look of a man the right configuration for the final chapter, and is not planning to complain about it. He was also, within 2 weeks, the unofficial center of gravity for anyone on the ranch who needed to talk through a problem. Delford had a dispute with a neighboring rancher about a fence line, and found himself explaining it to Silas before he'd even fully decided to bring it up. And Silas listened and asked 3 questions and said, "Document the original survey. Don't argue. Just put the documentation in front of him." The dispute resolved in a week. Delford told Bram about it without quite meeting his eyes, and Bram said nothing except, "Good," which was the right response. The schoolroom opened on a Monday morning in October, with 5 students, Delford's 2, a girl of 9 named Ada, and a boy of 7 named Roy, and the 3 Reyes children, ranging from 6 to 11. Ellison had spent 2 weeks getting the room ready and had been precise about it in the way she was precise about everything that mattered. The desks were from the carpenter in town, solid and right-sized. The blackboard was hung level. The books were arranged on the shelf by difficulty, not by subject, which was a system she'd developed over years of watching children approach shelves and choose wrongly. On the first morning, Ada Delford came in and looked at the blackboard and the desks and said, "Is this a real school?" "It's a real school," Elowen said. "My father said it might be," Ada said. She sat down with the serious purposefulness of a 9-year-old who has decided to take something seriously. He said the woman who set it up runs things properly. "Your father is generally right," Elowen said. "He says that too," Ada said. By the end of the first week, the oldest Reyes child, a girl named Lucia, 11, who could already read, but had never been taught to read with any system, was working through a history book with the focused intensity of someone who has discovered that the world is larger than she'd known and is trying to calculate how much larger. Elowen had seen that look before. It was the best look a teacher ever saw. It meant the work was doing what it was supposed to do. Bram proposed to Elowen in November, on a Tuesday evening, which was not a special day, and he had not planned the timing. They were walking the creek line after supper, checking the bank reinforcement Delford had been concerned about, and the evening was cold with the particular high desert cold that is clean rather than harsh. And the stars were beginning, and he stopped walking and turned to her. He did not make a speech. He was not a man built for speeches, and she was not a woman who needed them. He said, "I've been wanting to ask you for a while, and I keep finding reasons to wait, and I've decided that's the wrong approach." She looked at him. "What's the question?" "Marry me." "Not because of what we promised each other at 10. Because of what we've actually found out about each other since." He held her gaze. "Because I want to keep finding out things about you for as long as there are things to find." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to be difficult about the school," she said. "When it needs resources, I'm going to push for them even if the timing is inconvenient. I know that. And I'm going to continue corresponding with Margaret Finch about the council, because what happens in Red Willow still matters to me. It should. And I'm not going to stop having opinions about the account books, even though Silas is managing them properly." "Nobody's asking you to stop having opinions," Bram said. "That would be like asking the creek to run uphill." She looked at him. Then she said, "Yes." He exhaled just slightly, just enough to tell her that for all his steadiness he had not been entirely certain, and that the uncertainty had mattered. She found that she was glad of it. A man who was entirely certain was a man who wasn't paying attention. He kissed her there by the creek in the cold evening, and this time it was not a surprise to either of them, and it was still imperfect, in all the ways that real things are imperfect, and she did not mind even slightly. From the house, visible through the window, Silas appeared briefly in the lamplight. He looked toward the creek for a moment. Then he moved away from the window, and a minute later the lamp in his room went on, and he gave them the dark and the creek and the cold stars, which was the most tactful thing he had done in their shared memory. They married in March, under the cottonwoods along the creek, because there were cottonwoods here too, different trees, younger, but the same species. which meant something to Elowen in a way she didn't explain to anyone, because it was the kind of thing that sounds small when you say it, and is actually not small at all. It was not a large wedding. Delford Harris stood as witness on Bram's side, with the expression of a man doing something he has not done before, and finding it more emotional than he'd planned, and managing this by looking at the mountains. Silas stood on Elowen's side and held himself up very straight, and did not trust himself to say anything, so he said nothing, and his silence was the loudest and clearest expression of what he felt. The Reyes family came. Ada and Roy Delford came, and Ada wore a ribbon in her hair that she had tied herself, and that was slightly crooked, and she took her seat with the serious purposefulness that was her defining characteristic, and watched the proceedings with the attentive look of a child filing something important. Margaret Finch had sent a letter that arrived the week before. It was 3 pages long, and covered the council's current business, Crawford's ongoing tendency to speak first on budget matters, and Will Carey's management of the store, which she reported was going well. Carey had apparently already caught a short delivery from Haynes and sent it back at Haynes's expense, which Margaret described as a very good sign for his long-term prospects. The last paragraph said, "I am glad you went. I was worried you'd find a reason not to, which would have been a waste of the best negotiating mind Red Willow ever had. Be well, Elowen." You chose right. Elowen had folded that letter and put it in the tin box. The ceremony was short and honest. They said what they meant and not more than they meant, which was the appropriate length for a marriage that was not built on performance. The cottonwoods moved in the March wind. The creek ran alongside them, with the practical sound of water doing what water does, which is keep moving regardless of what happens on the bank. Silas shook Bram's hand afterward and held it for a moment and said quietly, "Take care of her." Bram said, "She takes care of herself. I'm just lucky she's willing to do it near me." Silas laughed. It was the right answer, he knew it, and he suspected Bram knew that he knew it. That was all right. A man who gives the right answer without knowing why he's giving it is lucky. A man who gives it because he actually understands it is something rarer. Years passed the way years do, on working land, not in dramatic chapters but in seasons, each one containing the ordinary accumulations of a real life, dry years and good years, cattle that did well and cattle that didn't. A summer when the East Pasture Creek ran lower than it had in a decade, and Bram spent 3 weeks rerouting a secondary channel that solved the problem imperfectly but well enough. A winter when Roy Harris broke his arm falling from the barn loft, and spent 6 weeks in the schoolroom, learning more than he would have in any ordinary season, because Elowen had time to work with him individually, and discovered that he had a facility for numbers that nobody had noticed because he'd been put at the back of the one-room school in town and left there. Elowen had 2 children. The first, a daughter, came 3 years after the wedding, and had Elowen's green eyes and Bram's quality of stillness, a child who watched everything carefully before she did anything, which was both useful and occasionally maddening. The second, a boy, came 2 years after that, and had no one's particular quality except his own, which was a restless curiosity that led him into every corner of the ranch by the time he was 4 and made him Delford Harris's shadow by the time he was 6. Because Delford was the person most willing to answer the same question 6 different times from slightly different angles. Silas was a grandfather in the way he'd been a father present, direct, useful, not given to softness but made of something better than softness, which was reliability. He kept the books until his 81st year, when his hands would not cooperate consistently, and then he taught Elowen's daughter to do it instead, with the patience of a man transmitting something he considers worth transmitting. He died on a winter morning, in the room with the porch view, with the mountains in the distance doing what they had been doing for longer than anyone alive. He had eaten breakfast. He had said the books needed one small correction before.